A pilot ejected over the South Atlantic. The water below him was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, a man in a flight suit has 12 minutes before his heart stops. His name was Carlos Perona. He was 27 years old. He was flying the fastest fighter Argentina owned, a Mirage 3EA, capable of Mach 2.2. 30 seconds earlier, he had been shot down by a British aircraft that could not even break the sound barrier, a subsonic naval fighter the Royal Air Force had once dismissed as a toy. For years afterward, Carlos Perona reflected on what had happened that morning. This is the story of why. 10:35 in the morning, 1st of May, 1982. The sky over the western approaches to the Falkland Islands, a cold sun burning through cloud at 15,000 feet. In the cockpit of a Sea Harrier climbing east, Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton felt his radar warning receiver stop humming and start screaming. He was 30 years old. He had trained for this moment for a decade. He had never expected to live it. 5 miles ahead of him, Perona's Mirage 3EA was making a supersonic climb toward interception. He believed, as every Argentine pilot believed that morning, that he had every advantage. He was wrong about that. He had none of them. Barton locked the target. He waited. He waited for the seeker head on his AIM-9L Sidewinder to growl. And when it did, he pressed the pickle button on the stick, and the missile came off the rail with a hiss and a plume of gray smoke. And it climbed toward the Argentine fighter at over 2 times the speed of sound. Perona saw nothing. His radar warning receiver was designed to detect an old missile fired from behind. This missile was coming at him from the front. His warning receiver did not know what to say. 30 seconds later, the sky above the South Atlantic was full of aluminum. Perona ejected. His parachute opened over an ocean cold enough to kill a man in 12 minutes. He survived because a rescue helicopter reached him in time. 2 months earlier, on the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces had landed on the Falkland Islands. The islands sat 400 miles east of Argentina in the freezing waters of the South Atlantic. Britain had held them since 1833. Argentina had claimed them just as long. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's response was immediate and startling. She would send a fleet. She would send it 8,000 miles across 2 oceans. She would take back the islands or her government would fall. The problem was that Britain no longer had the tools for the job. By 1982, the Royal Navy had no strike carriers. In 1966, the Wilson government had canceled the last of them, a ship called CV-01. With that decision, Britain had lost the ability to project conventional fighter aircraft from the sea. The generals had accepted this. The politicians had accepted this. Only the Fleet Air Arm had not. So when the task force sailed from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, its air cover consisted of 20 small aircraft flying from 2 small carriers. 20 Sea Harrier FRS-1S. 8 Royal Air Force Harrier GR-3S would join later. Against them stood the Argentine Air Force and Naval Aviation. Roughly 200 combat aircraft, Mirages, Daggers, Skyhawks, Super Etendards, Canberras, 10-1, in the wrong direction. Many within the British defense establishment were skeptical that the Sea Harrier alone could secure air superiority. Some hoped it might survive it. The man who did believe was named Nigel Ward. He was 39 years old. Everyone called him Sharky. He was a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy, and he commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible. He had flown Phantoms. He had flown Harriers. He had flown 3 operational tours before this one. Sharky Ward was not a diplomat. In peacetime, he had argued with admirals. He had argued with air marshals. He had argued with anyone in a senior uniform who claimed the Sea Harrier could not fight. He had insisted, sometimes at the cost of his own career, that a subsonic aircraft with the right radar, the right missile, and the right pilot could beat any supersonic fighter in the world, at the ranges naval combat actually occurred at. Almost no one had listened. In the years before the war, Ward had led 801 Squadron through a series of dissimilar air combat trials. He had flown Sea Harriers against United States Air Force F-15 Eagles, against French Mirages, against West German F-4 Phantoms, against F-104 Starfighters. Ward later cited favorable exchange ratios from several pre-war training exercises, although the exact figures vary between sources. The trials had been quietly filed. The results had not been advertised. Ward had drilled his pilots on the aircraft's Blue Fox radar, the small pulse Doppler set in the nose that most Fleet Air Arm officers considered a nuisance. He had trained them in night intercepts, in low-level dogfighting over water, in radar management under stress. When the task force sailed, his pilots were, statistically, the most current and best-trained naval fighter crews in the world. None of that was on the front pages. What was on the front pages was that Britain was going to war with Harriers. Here is the first thing to understand about why the Argentine pilots could not explain what happened to them. The aircraft they underestimated had nearly been canceled twice. In 1966, the Naval Strike Carrier program had died with CVA-01. In the early 1970s, the Sea Harrier itself had been blocked, delayed, and denied funding by a defense establishment that believed vertical takeoff was a novelty and that the future belonged to swing-wing supersonic fighters. The Sea Harrier, FRS-1, existed in 1982 because a small group of naval officers, Sharky Ward among them, had refused to let it die. The men who despised the Sea Harrier most before the Falklands War were not Argentine. They were British. Argentina had actually considered buying a variant years earlier and been turned away. They had thought of it as a serious aircraft. Whitehall had thought of it as an embarrassment. That is the first twist. The Argentines did not underestimate the Sea Harrier out of stupidity. They underestimated it because Britain herself had spent a decade teaching the world to underestimate it. At Rio Gallegos, 435 nautical miles west of the Falklands, Grupo Ocho de Casa waited on the tarmac beside their Mirage 3EAS. The Mirage 3EA was a delta-wing fighter of French design. It could fly at Mach 2.2. It carried Matra Magic missiles. It had been sold to Argentina in the early 1970s as a first-line interceptor, and Israel had used its close cousin in 1967 to crush 3 Arab air forces in 6 days. It was the pride of Argentine aviation. It had been designed for exactly one job: to sit on ready alert at high altitude, launch upward at Mach 2, and destroy a Soviet strategic bomber approaching Western Europe above 40,000 feet. It had never been designed to loiter at low level over water. It had never been designed for close combat. It had never been designed for a war fought at 400 miles from base with no aerial refueling. That was not the aircraft's fault. That was the aircraft's specification. In the wrong war, the finest interceptor in the world is a taxi with wings. Perona did not know this. His commanders did not know this. On the morning of the 1st of May, they were about to find out. There is a second thing to understand, and it is stranger than the first. The Sea Harrier alone would not have been enough. Sharky Ward would not have been enough. Radar training would not have been enough. Something else arrived in early April, quietly, without press coverage, without a photograph, without a name in any newspaper. The United States Navy delivered a weapon. In the first weeks of April 1982, President Ronald Reagan gave a general directive to his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and his Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman. The directive was brief. Give the British what they need. Weinberger authorized an emergency transfer from United States Navy Atlantic Fleet stocks. About 105 AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles were flown to Ascension Island. From Ascension, they were shipped south to the task force. No paperwork went through the standard foreign military sales channel. It happened outside the process. The AIM-9L was not the Sidewinder the Argentines had studied. Every version of the Sidewinder before it, the Bravo, the Delta, the Golf, had been a tail chase weapon. It saw the heat coming out of the enemy's exhaust. To fire it, you had to fly around behind him. Argentine pilots had trained their entire careers on the assumption that any missile from a Western fighter would arrive from 6 o'clock. The AIM-9L was different. Its seeker head was cooled by expanding argon gas to nearly 200 degrees below 0 Celsius. It could see the heat of the leading edge of an aircraft's wings, warmed by air friction, even head-on. It could be fired at any angle. It could pull 30 Gs in turns. It was far more resistant to flares than earlier Sidewinder variants. Perona's radar warning receiver had not screamed because it detected a launch behind him. It had screamed because a missile was approaching him from the front. His entire mental model of air combat had been wrong before he took off that morning. He had no way to know that. The second twist is this. The weapon that decided the air war over the Falklands was not the Sea Harrier. It was a missile that arrived in secret, weeks before the first shot, following President Ronald Reagan's decision to provide extensive military support to Britain during the conflict. The Argentine Air Force never learned that this transfer had happened. Their pilots flew a war they believed was symmetrical. It had not been symmetrical since the first week of April. They would only understand this decades later. By then, most of them would be old. Some of them would be dead. The answer they had been looking for would already have been printed elsewhere, in books written by the men who shot them down. The war had not started with the missile leaving Barton's rail on the 1st of May. It had started, quietly, on a runway on Ascension Island in early April, when a wooden crate was loaded onto an aircraft carrier bound south. By the time Carlos Perona strapped into his Mirage that morning, the outcome of his flight had already been decided by two men he had never heard of. 5,000 miles away, 4:40 in the morning, 1st of May, 1982. Long before Barton's missile left its rail. Long before Perona strapped in at Rio Gallegos. A single aircraft was inbound to Stanley from the north at 40,000 feet. It was a Vulcan bomber. Serial number XM607. It had taken off from Ascension Island the previous night. It had refueled from a chain of Victor tankers stretched across 4,000 miles of empty ocean. Its crew had been awake for 14 hours. Its bomb bay carried 21,000-pound bombs. At 4:46, it dropped them across the runway at Port Stanley Airfield in a diagonal stick. 20 of the bombs cratered the field around the strip. One of them hit the runway itself, near the northern end, and blew a crater 30 feet across. Militarily, the raid changed almost nothing. A single crater in a runway can be filled in a day. Argentine engineers filled it. Stanley continued to operate light aircraft and Hercules transports throughout the war. Psychologically, it changed everything. Because in Buenos Aires, at the headquarters of the Argentine Air Force, the staff officers looked at the map and did the arithmetic. A Vulcan bomber that could reach Stanley could reach Buenos Aires. It could reach Cordoba. It could reach the industrial cities. It could, in theory, reach anything. The Argentine Air Force had exactly 2 KC-130 Hercules tankers. It had no long-range interceptors on alert. It had no early warning radar covering the Atlantic approaches to the mainland. It could not stop a Vulcan. The decision came down within days. By the end of the first week of May, the Mirage 3EA fighters of Grupo 8, the only aircraft in the Argentine inventory theoretically capable of intercepting a Vulcan at 40,000 feet, would be pulled back from offensive operations over the Falklands. They would sit on strip alert at Rio Gallegos and Comodoro Rivadavia, waiting for a Vulcan raid on the mainland that would never come. The Blackbuck raids contributed to Argentina's decision to retain Mirage 3 fighters on mainland air defense duties. That is the third piece of the puzzle. Operational constraints had placed the Mirage 3 at a major disadvantage before sustained air combat even began. Not because the Mirage was bad, because a single bomb on a distant airstrip had made her generals afraid of losing their own capital. For the rest of the war, the interceptor mission over the islands would be flown by the Dagger. The Dagger was an Israeli-built copy of the older Mirage 5. It had no radar for air combat. It had shorter legs than the Mirage 3EA. It carried the same short-range magic missile that could only be fired from behind, and it would carry the load of an air war it had never been designed to fight. But on the 1st of May, in the hours between the Vulcan raid and the withdrawal order, the Mirage 3 EA pilots of Grupo 8 still flew. Perona flew. Captain Gustavo Garcia Cuerva, his flight leader, flew. Garcia Cuerva was in his mid-30s. He was a career officer. He was married. He had children. He had spent his adult life training for a war against a Soviet bomber that was not coming. And now he was being sent in an aircraft designed for that other war, to fight a British subsonic fighter over the ocean at the extreme range of his fuel. He did not complain. Argentine pilots did not complain. They flew. Perona flew as his wingman. They climbed out of Rio Gallegos into the same morning sky that would, less than an hour later, kill one of them and take the other prisoner of the sea. Barton and Lieutenant Steve Thomas had launched from HMS Invincible on combat air patrol. Barton was 30. Thomas was 27. They were flying a fighting pair. They had been briefed that morning by Sharkey Ward personally. Ward's brief was short. He did not moralize. He did not motivate. He told his pilots what the radar would show them, what the enemy was likely to do, and how to kill him with the AEM-9L. At 10:35, the intercept happened. Barton locked Perona. Barton fired. Perona ejected. Thomas fired at Garcia Cuerva. The Sidewinder tracked. The Mirage was damaged. It could not make it back to the mainland. Garcia Cuerva turned towards Stanley, the only friendly runway within reach. He crossed the coast low. He was streaming fuel. He was jettisoning ordnance to reduce weight. He tried to identify himself to the Argentine anti-aircraft gunners defending the airfield. The gunners had been under British air attack for hours. They were nervous. They saw an unfamiliar silhouette approaching low from the west, and their radar showed no scheduled friendly traffic. They opened fire. Their Oerlikon guns hit Garcia Cuerva's aircraft as it turned onto final. He was killed in the cockpit. His Mirage burned on the approach. Some sources still record him as killed in air combat. The Argentine Air Force itself investigated the incident and concluded, quietly, that his own side had brought him down. This detail has been argued about for decades. it does not change the essential shape of the day. On the 1st of May, 3 Argentine fighter pilots died. 2 of them, Garcia Cuerva and Lieutenant Jose Ardiles, were killed by weapons whose existence they had not fully understood. Ardiles was flying a Dagger with Grupo 6. He was in his mid-30s. He was a cousin of a footballer many British viewers of a certain age will remember, Osvaldo Ardiles of Tottenham Hotspur, who was playing football in England on the day his cousin died over the South Atlantic. Jose Ardiles was killed later that afternoon by a Sea Harrier flown by Lieutenant Bertie Penfold of 800 Naval Air Squadron. On the scoreboard, the day ended 3-0. On the ground, 3 families lost sons. On the mainland, the Argentine General Staff finally began to understand that something in their assumptions had been wrong. They did not know what yet. The 4th piece of the puzzle is the map itself. Argentina's forward fighter bases sat at the tip of the continent. Rio Grande, 380 nautical miles from Stanley. San Julian, 415. Rio Gallegos, 435. Comodoro Rivadavia, 480. A Mirage or a Dagger flying from any of them arrived over the Falklands with the fuel needle already falling. In ideal conditions, it had 5 to 15 minutes to fight. Then it turned back or it drowned. The 2 KC-130 tankers could refuel a handful of aircraft each day. They could not sustain a fighter presence. Argentina's Air Force had been built to defend a border with Chile across the Andes. It had never been built to reach out into an ocean. The British aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible sat 100 miles east of the islands. A Sea Harrier on combat air patrol had 90 minutes on station. It could be relieved. It could be refueled and cycled again the same day. Its pilot flew a war measured in patrols. The Argentine pilot flew a war measured in fuel bingo. That is why the ledger read the way it did. Not because Argentine pilots were worse, because they were arriving at the fight already almost out of time. Sharkey Ward said in a later interview that he had felt sorry for them, coming that far, for that long, to fight for that few minutes, in an aircraft not built for the mission. He said it flatly. He did not dress it up. In the 2nd week of May, Brigadier General Ernesto Crespo, commander of the Argentine Southern Air Force, made the decision that would define the rest of the war. The Mirage 3 EA fleet, already withdrawn from Falklands airspace by the Vulcan threat, would remain withdrawn. It would not return. The Dagger and the A4 Skyhawk would continue to attack the British fleet, but they would be ordered to avoid air combat with the Sea Harriers whenever possible. Their mission would be to hit ships and go home. If the Sea Harriers found them, they were to run. Officially, Crespo justified this to his superiors with the argument that the Mirage was needed on the mainland against the Vulcan. That was the story on paper. The story he understood in private was different. The Mirage could not fight this war. Its base was too far. Its fuel was too short. His weapons were the wrong ones. He could not say this to Buenos Aires without admitting that Argentina had gone to war with the wrong air force. So he used the strategic fear to hide a tactical failure. The generals in the capital nodded and agreed. The Vulcan must be countered. The Mirage must stay north. Nobody in the general staff pressed further. That is the 4th twist. The withdrawal was officially justified by the perceived threat of further Vulcan attacks, although operational limitations of the Mirage 3 also played a major role to protect a truth that could not be admitted. The men in Buenos Aires believed they had made a strategic choice. They had actually accepted a tactical surrender they did not know they were signing. Meanwhile, the Dagger and the Skyhawk pilots continued to fly. They flew low over the sea, sometimes 20 feet above the wave tops, to stay under the British radar horizon. They flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire from the frigates and destroyers escorting the landing force. They pressed home their attacks. And, in doing so, they proved something that the propaganda of the war has never entirely acknowledged. Captain Pablo Carballo of Grupo 5 flew an A-4B Skyhawk. He was in his mid-30s. He had a wife. He had a daughter. On the 21st of May, he attacked HMS Ardent in San Carlos water and left her burning. On the 23rd of May, HMS Antelope was hit by 2,000-pound bombs delivered by Grupo 5 Skyhawks and broke in half after one of them detonated during a defusing attempt. On the 25th of May, Argentina's National Day, Grupo 5 hit HMS Coventry. She capsized in 20 minutes. 19 British sailors died with her. Carballo survived the war. He flew mission after mission at wave-top altitude, alone or in flights of 2 and 3, into the teeth of the most concentrated naval anti-aircraft fire the Western world had seen since the Pacific in 1945. He never claimed to be a hero. In interviews given decades later, he described the missions in the tone of a man reading a maintenance report. The fifth piece of this puzzle is that Argentine pilots did not lose because they lacked courage. They did not lose because they lacked skill. They did not lose, mostly, in air combat at all. They killed British ships. They killed British sailors. 6 major Royal Navy vessels went to the bottom of the South Atlantic or were burned out and abandoned. Sheffield, Ardent, Antelope, Coventry, Atlantic Conveyor, Sir Galahad. All were lost as a result of Argentine air attacks, although some sank later because of secondary explosions or damage control failures. The Sea Harrier could not stop them from reaching the fleet. The Sea Harrier stopped some of them. The rest got through. What saved the British fleet, in the end, was not entirely the Sea Harrier. It was something quieter and stranger and more difficult to talk about. A significant number of Argentine bombs failed to detonate because of fuse arming issues associated with extremely low-altitude attacks. To fly under British radar, the Skyhawk and Dagger pilots had to release their 1,000-pound bombs at altitudes of 30 to 50 feet above the waves. At those altitudes, the standard Mark 82 general-purpose bomb, fitted with a delay fuse, did not have time to arm before it hit the target. The fuse required a certain distance of free flight. A bomb released at 50 feet and traveling horizontally simply did not fly that distance before it struck the side of a British warship. At least 13 bombs hit Royal Navy ships during the campaign and failed to detonate. Some passed clean through the hull and came out the other side. Some lodged in engineering spaces and were defused. Some were carried out to sea by damaged ships and dropped over the side. After the war, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir David Craig said in an interview that the Royal Navy had lost as many ships as it could afford to lose. Any more, and the task force would have been forced to withdraw. Any more, and Britain would have lost the war. That is the sixth twist. The Royal Navy did not survive the Falklands air campaign because the Sea Harrier was invincible. It survived because the Argentine bombs, delivered by brave men flying difficult missions at impossible altitudes, could not arm themselves in time to explode. Every Argentine pilot who went home that summer went home believing his Air Force had been beaten in the sky. In truth, his Air Force had been beaten by the physics of a fuse mechanism designed 30 years earlier for aircraft that flew higher. There is a myth about the Sea Harrier that Americans of a certain age will remember from magazine articles in the 1980s. It was called VIF-ing, vectoring in forward flight. The idea that a Harrier pilot could rotate his engine nozzles downward in mid-dogfight, decelerate violently, and cause an enemy fighter to overshoot him. It made for wonderful magazine copy. It made for wonderful cocktail party physics. Sharkey Ward, when he wrote his memoir a decade later, dismissed it in a single line. His pilots almost never used VIF-ing in real air combat. It was a peacetime trick. It was not the reason the Sea Harrier won. The reason the Sea Harrier won was four things, and all of them were systemic. The Blue Fox radar performed better than many expected, although its look-down capability still had important limitations. The AIM-9L could kill him from any angle. The pilots had been trained by Ward and men like him in the discipline of radar-guided naval combat. And the aircraft, small and simple and designed for hard conditions, worked when it was needed. 90% availability across the campaign. Tim Gedge later cited exceptionally high serviceability rates for 809 Squadron, although published figures vary slightly between sources, which flew 1,500 sorties without losing a single aircraft to mechanical failure. None of that made a good headline. None of that fit the myth of a small British aircraft, launched by trick and cunning, defeating supersonic giants. The myth was cleaner. The truth was industrial. On the 4th of May, 3 days after Barton's first kill, a Sea Harrier flown by Lieutenant Nick Taylor of 800 Naval Air Squadron attacked the airfield at Goose Green. He was 32. He was flying at low altitude to place his cluster bombs on Argentine aircraft on the ground. His approach carried him through the arc of an Oerlikon 35mm anti-aircraft gun. He was hit at close range and killed instantly in the cockpit. His aircraft crashed on the outskirts of Goose Green. The Argentine garrison recovered his body and buried him with full military honors. They erected a simple cross above the grave. A photograph exists of that cross. It is not a photograph the Argentine Air Force is embarrassed by. The men who shot him down understood what he had been trying to do. They had been trying to do the same thing. The seventh twist is that the story of the Sea Harrier being invincible has to erase Nick Taylor to be told. It has to erase the fact that he flew an unsurvivable approach through a wall of 35mm fire on a mission ordered by his commanders, in the same aircraft the world would later call untouchable. He is absent from every article that ever declared the Sea Harrier undefeated. He was undefeated the way a man in a coffin is undefeated. He simply did not come home to answer the question. On the 8th of June, 6 days before the war ended, Flight Lieutenant Dave Morgan and Lieutenant Dave Smith of 800 Naval Air Squadron were flying combat air patrol at 4,000 feet over Choiseul Sound. Morgan was 34. Smith was 28. They saw smoke on the water. A landing ship called Sir Galahad had been hit. Argentine Skyhawks were still in the area, low over the sea, headed home. Morgan called Smith and put his nose down. 4 A-4B Skyhawks of Group 05 were racing west at 50 feet above the water. Morgan closed from behind. He fired 2 AIM-9Ls in less than a minute. 2 Skyhawks exploded. Smith fired a third. Another Skyhawk cartwheeled into the sea. The Argentine pilots killed in that engagement were Lieutenant Juan Araras, Lieutenant Danilo Bolzan, and Ensign Alfredo Vasquez. 2 of them were in their 20s. One was in his early 30s. They had spent the previous 10 minutes bombing a British landing ship. They did not see the Sea Harriers behind them until the missiles arrived. Morgan was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He did not talk about the engagement much. In one interview years later, asked how it felt, he said only that they had been going home, and he had shot them in the back, and that was what the war had asked of him. That was the last major air-to-air engagement of the campaign. 6 days later, on the 14th of June, General Mario Menendez surrendered the Argentine garrison at Port Stanley. The war was over. The scoreboard was closed. The men who had flown Mirages and daggers went home to a country in the middle of a political collapse. The men who had flown Sea Harriers went home to a country in the middle of a coronation. The question, however, had not been answered. Why had the Sea Harrier won? The Argentine pilots would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. Some of them would give the wrong answer. Some of them would give the right answer. And nobody in the wider world would listen. The final piece of the puzzle waited for them at home, on the other side of the ocean, in the paperwork of an Air Force preparing to explain a defeat it did not fully understand. 14th of June, 1982, late afternoon at Government House in Port Stanley. A room heated by paraffin lamps and the breath of tired men. General Mario Menendez sat at a table with a document in front of him. Across from him sat Major General Jeremy Moore of the Royal Marines. Between them lay a single sheet of paper, the instrument of surrender. Menendez read it. He read it again. He picked up a pen. He crossed out the word unconditional. He signed underneath. Moore accepted the change without comment. 74 days of war ended with the stroke of a pen and the correction of a word. Outside the window, snow was falling on the harbor. Argentine soldiers were laying down their rifles in long gray lines along the road to the airfield. Inside the harbor, sunken hulks marked the places where Sheffield and Coventry and Ardent and Antelope no longer sat. On the deck of HMS Hermes, 100 miles to the east, the Sea Harriers of 800 Naval Air Squadron were being tied down for the last time. The scoreboard, when it was totaled, read as follows: 20. Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat by Sea Harriers. 0 Sea Harriers destroyed in air-to-air combat by Argentine fighters. 20.7 AM-9L Sidewinders fired. 19 confirmed hits. A missile hit rate of over 70%, higher than any air-to-air weapon in any war before it. 6 Sea Harriers lost in total. 2 to ground fire. 4 to accidents and weather. 4 pilots killed. Taylor, Bat, Otten Jones, Curtis. The other 2 who went into the sea, Lieutenant Commander Mike Broadwater and Lieutenant Commander Ian Mortimer, ejected and survived. 90% fleet availability across the campaign. 98% for Tim Gedge's 809 Squadron. 1,500 sorties flown. One of the most successful small carrier air campaigns in modern naval aviation. None of it answered the question that had opened the war. Why had the Sea Harrier won? The Argentine pilots came home to a country in the middle of a collapse. Within 4 days of the surrender, President Leopoldo Galtieri had resigned. Within 6 months, the junta was finished. Within a year, Argentina was voting in democratic elections for the first time in a generation. The men who had flown Mirages and daggers over the South Atlantic returned to a nation that no longer wanted to look at them. At Rio Gallegos and Rio Grande, on the shuttered flight lines, the pilots wrote after-action reports. They filed them upward. They waited for a national conversation about what had gone wrong. That conversation did not come. Not in the first year, not in the 5th year, not until the veterans themselves began to speak, in interviews, in memoirs, in academic conferences held decades later. When they did speak, they said something clearer than what the world had chosen to hear. Brigadier General Ernesto Crespo, the man who had withdrawn the Mirages, gave a series of interviews after the war. He did not blame his pilots. He did not blame the aircraft. He said, in essence, that his Air Force had been trained for the wrong war. It had been trained to intercept high-altitude bombers over the Andes. It had been sent to fight low-level combat over water 400 miles from base. It had been given no aerial refueling worth the name. It had been given missiles that could only be fired from behind. It had been sent against an enemy that had all of those things and more. He did not use the word defeat. He used the word mismatch. It was, he said, the correct word. Captain Pablo Carballo participated in attacks that seriously damaged several British ships, including HMS Ardent from the cockpit of an A4 Skyhawk, gave interviews in which he was asked, over and over again, why he had not been shot down more often. His answer was flat. He had been lucky. His pilots had been brave. And the Sea Harrier could not be everywhere at once. If it had been, none of the Argentine pilots would have come home. He said this without bitterness. He said it as an engineer might describe the failure of a component. The Argentine after-action reports, once they were declassified, showed something quieter than the world's version of the war. They did not describe a defeat by a superior aircraft. They described a defeat by a superior system, radar, missile, training, availability, distance, refueling, doctrine. Every one of those categories had been decided years before the war began. Every one of them had gone against Argentina before Perona ever climbed into his cockpit. That is the eighth twist. The men the Western press treated as unable to explain their defeat had in fact explained it clearly, in their own language, in their own time. Their answer had simply not been the answer the West wanted to publish. The West wanted David and Goliath. The West wanted biffing and cunning and pluck. Argentina offered logistics. Logistics does not sell magazines. When Argentina finally re-equipped its Air Force in the years after the war, it did not buy a faster fighter. It did not buy a supersonic replacement for the Mirage. It bought the A4AR, an upgraded Skyhawk with modern radar and a better weapons interface. It invested in early warning. It invested in aerial refueling. It rebuilt its doctrine around the lessons of the South Atlantic. The Argentine Air Force had understood what the Western press had not. The problem had never been the airframe. The problem had been the system around the airframe. Argentina later addressed several of the operational shortcomings identified during the Falklands War. That does not mean the pilots got what they deserved. On the British side, the men who had flown Sea Harriers came home to a country in the mood for celebration. The task force sailed into Portsmouth Harbor in triumph. Crowds lined the shore. Bands played. The Fleet Air Arm, which had spent a decade being told it was a museum piece, was suddenly, briefly, the pride of the country. Sharkey Ward was not among the men in that spotlight. He had commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron, with a distinction that his own record made undeniable. He had personally shot down 3 enemy aircraft. His squadron had flown 248 air combat patrol sorties. He had proven, in the most public possible way, that everything he had argued about the Sea Harrier for a decade had been correct. He was not promoted afterward. He was not given a senior command. Within 2 years of the surrender, he had left the Royal Navy, and the reasons for his leaving were not made public, but were understood inside the service to involve a fundamental disagreement with the way the war had been remembered and the way credit had been distributed. His superiors, including Admiral Sir Sandy Woodward, the task force commander, had received the decorations and the knighthoods. Ward had received a medal and a farewell. In 1992, Ward published a memoir. He called it Sea Harrier over the Falklands. It was a plain book, written in the same flat voice he had used in the ready room. In it, he named names. He described who had made the right decisions and who had made the wrong ones. He was particularly hard on Woodward, whom he accused of having misunderstood the air campaign from the start and of having endangered the task force by keeping the carriers too far east. The book was not well received in official Navy circles. Ward was not invited to speak at the anniversary events. He was not called to the reunions. The Royal Navy, in the quiet way institutions have of doing these things, closed the door. That is the 9th twist. The man who had done the most to keep the Sea Harrier alive and had then flown it to a victory that vindicated everything he had said about it, was pushed to the edges of his own service after the war. Ward later argued that his contribution to the air campaign was not fully recognized by the Royal Navy. The institution he had served was not built to admit that its critic had been right. It was built to remember its admirals. Ward continued to speak and write about the war for the rest of his life. He gave interviews. He appeared on documentaries. He argued, until the end, that the Sea Harrier had not won by trick or by miracle, but by the boring accumulation of correct decisions made by men who had been ignored for years. He was not the only one erased. Lieutenant Bertie Penfold, the pilot who had killed Jose Ardiles on the 1st of May, left the Fleet Air Arm not long after the war. Killing another pilot from 6 miles away with an infrared missile is a strange thing to carry. It does not always leave a man the way it found him. He rarely spoke about the mission that had made him famous inside the squadron and unknown outside it. Nick Taylor's grave at Goose Green was maintained by the Argentine garrison for the duration of the occupation. When British forces retook the settlement in late May, they found the cross still standing. It is still there today, on a windswept slope above a bay. British and Argentine visitors both leave flowers on it. Neither side has ever taken it down. Gordon Batt's family received a letter and a medal. His aircraft was never recovered. John Ayton Jones and Alan Curtis were never found. The South Atlantic kept them. There is one more piece of this story. On the 8th of June, in the same engagement that ended with 3 Argentine pilots dead in the water off Choiseul Sound, Flight Lieutenant Dave Morgan had scored what would prove to be one of the last British air-to-air victories of the 20th century. He did not use the word victory. He said, in his interview years later, that the men he had killed had been going home. He did not describe them as enemies. He described them as pilots. That distinction matters. It is the distinction the men who flew this war made among themselves and rarely made in public. Argentine and British pilots met in the decades after the war, at reunions and academic conferences and private dinners. They spoke to each other with a directness that neither could offer to their own countrymen. They discussed the missions. They compared notes on the equipment. They mourned the dead together. Perona lived. He returned to the Argentine Air Force. He flew again. He never gave a full public interview about the shoot-down of the 1st of May. When asked, he tended to change the subject. Some silences are their own kind of answer. The final twist of this story is not a surprise. It is a correction. The Argentine pilots could explain how the Sea Harriers had beaten their Mirages. They explained it clearly. They explained it in their own after-action reports. They explained it in interviews. They explained it in memoirs. They said, in essence, that the war had been decided by 4 things. Radar they did not have. Missiles they could not counter. Training their Air Force had not received. And 100 miles of ocean between their runway and the fight. The Western press did not want that answer. It wanted a hero and a giant and a slingshot. It wanted VIFing and pluck. It wanted a Sea Harrier that was invincible because it was British, and a Mirage that was inadequate because it was Argentine. The pilots knew better. They had always known better. Their explanation had been sitting in the archives of the Fuerza Aérea Argentina for 40 years. It had been available in translation for 30. It had been reprinted in aviation journals and academic monographs and quiet corners of the internet. It had simply not been the answer the world had asked for. So the world had gone on asking the question. The question that opens this film has an answer. The answer is that there was no mystery. There was only a war fought at 400 miles from base against an enemy who had thought carefully for a decade about how to win it, and had bought or borrowed or invented every piece of the puzzle he needed. There was only a system that worked against a system that did not. There was only a group of men on both sides, brave in more or less equal measure, sent into a fight that had been decided before they took off. The Sea Harrier did not win by magic. It won by planning. The Mirage did not lose by cowardice. It lost by geography. Perona survived. Carballo survived. Ward survived and wrote it down. Morgan survived and told the truth. Barton survived. Penfold survived. Ould survived and wore his Distinguished Service Cross on the days when the Navy expected it and put it away when it did not. Taylor did not survive. Batt did not. Ayton Jones and Curtis were kept by the sea. Garcia Cuerva burned on the approach to a runway defended by his own countrymen. Ardiles never came home to his cousin. Araras and Bolsan and Vasquez went into the water off Choiseul Sound with their bombs already delivered and their landing lights already switched on for the trip home. They were pilots. They flew for their countries. Their countries used them in more or less equal measure and buried them in more or less equal ceremony and remembered them in more or less equal silence. That is the whole story. It has been available all along.